Hello and welcome to PhDear Diary. My name is Andy Salkeld and this is my video blog during the time of undertaking a PhD at Leeds Beckett University. It's the height of summer now here in the UK. I think we're around 22 weeks in. This is the first week where we've kind of experienced heat, as hot as things can get in the UK, and I am definitely feeling it. And it is getting increasingly hard to concentrate during the heat. But that's kind of where we are. Last week, I was here speaking to you about kind of the process I was going through with regards to developing my survey and then working on my ethics documentation. This week, I have finished my ethics, and I have now I've passed it over to my supervisors, who are going to take a look at it and kind of just raise anything in a bit of a review before I submit it to the actual the ethics board for approval. And this is a really important part in kind of all work. It's very important in psychology because we deal with people and we deal with their behaviours, actions, cognitions, and experiences. And therefore, as soon as you start interacting with people, there's a chance of you affecting them. And what you don't want is to inadvertently cause harm. Not saying that causing harm would happen, but you don't want to inadvertently do something that could be harmful to participants in your studies. Now, this is obvious from kind of the perspective of when you're kind of doing something like, say, a galvanic skin response, so actually physically measuring something, or whether it's something to do with neurotransmitters in the blood. Like, as soon as you're doing something invasive, it's very obvious about their potentially being harmful. But when you're doing something like a survey, it's a bit more complex because it's about kind of triggering memories and kind of putting people in positions where they're not comfortable, or where they may be where they may kind of struggle with a situation because of something that's happened in their past, etc. So, as weird as it sounds, even though I'm doing something completely non-invasive, I still have to go through a very strict ethical procedure. And this is very common to what we see in lots of other practices and so on. So, in accounting, particularly in practice as an advisor or anything like that, you always have to go through kind of various, I think they're called KYC checks, know your client, where you have to check that there's kind of no conflicts of interest, no kind of nothing that could bias your work, but also to check that who you're working with is not doing something that could compromise your integrity. And it's kind of a bit of a back and forth, but ethics is very important in all of business, and it's something I think we could do with being a lot better at. But anyway, so I've submitted that. It was an arduous process. Writing up the documentation is always a challenge, but it is interesting to look at all the things we have to tick box. The worst part by far was extracting my survey from Qualtrics and then kind of painfully typesetting it into Word so that it can be included in an appendix for a reviewer to review. Painful but necessary, because in the way I always approach work, I would rather provide everything and that be an over provision than under provide and not kind of get various things ticked off. So, for example, as I mentioned last week, the potential of working with accountant and law firms to kind of distribute my work to their clients is something that would need ethical approval. So I made sure to kind of discuss that in detail. Now, it's not submitted yet. I'm not actually undertaking the ethics. I'm waiting for kind of this review to come back. But in general, it's in the process. So hopefully it will be submitted this side of August, which is great. Which kind of leaves me in this bit of a lull period where, like, obviously I need to get my ethics done, get that submitted. But then what am I working towards? Because I need ethical approval to come back. I need to go through the back and forth of adjusting things to make sure that they're happy with it. Then I need to go through funding approval. So that's a kind of, it's a process where there's lots of times when it's out of my control, which is a strange period because it's very process driven. So what I've been thinking about is, what am I going to do that is going to progress my PhD in the meantime? Now, obviously PhDs involve writing, so writing and reading around the subject is kind of my first port of call. But what I was thinking about that I genuinely want to do now is I want to start working on an article. Now, whether it goes into a scientific position, whether it goes onto my blog, whether I post it on LinkedIn, whether I give it to one of the accounting firms that wants to be involved and so on, and have them post it. There's lots of opportunities here, but what I want to write about really is competing values finance. And so the competing values framework is at the center of my study, or my studies, which is basically saying that businesses can be subdivided based on their cultures, based on their focus being internal or external, and their willingness to change being stability or change orientated, which creates 4 different typesets of businesses and their cultures with various kind of beliefs, values, behaviours within them. And what I've done as part of my study is create versions of these for finance teams, and where the emphasis is, where their beliefs, values, and behaviours align. And what I've found most fascinating about it is you can actually align different parts of the competing values framework to financial behaviours. So for some of them, where you are emphasising kind of stability and internal, so this is the bureaucratic quadrant. This is very much about kind of internal audit, process control, making sure that repetition leads to efficiency, because you do the same process again and again and again, and you become more efficient at it, leading to slow incremental gains over the course of slow and steady evolution. And you talk about that and you're like, okay, you can really see that emphasis in some finance teams. Now, these are typically larger, big business, very much, right, I want to make sure you're doing the same thing over and over again. I want to know that we're ticking off all these things on everything. So there will be a documented process somewhere. They'll probably likely run parallel with, say, an IT department or a change management department, where finance makes sure that all the kind of processes are documented, that accountability is assigned, and that everything like that is done. Then, like as another example, we have the rational goal model. So this is where we look externally but favour stability, where doing things fast is kind of the emphasis. So this doing things first is where it's external and change orientated, and that's the kind of adhocracy, what people would assign to be, say, a tech startup sort of thing, where they just want to get things done. And what I'm thinking is, there are all these different aspects of finance, and when I've spoken to financiers about them, they're very much like, I can actually see these different parts of finance. They said the hardest one to see was the adhocracy finance team, because that's typically it's in finance, you still have to do the day-to-day. You still have to process numbers and do the boring bits of finance, where you just have to run the ledgers, you just have to do this. But I suppose the way you emphasize that is how much time is allocated to each thing. So the more senior people in finance will be helping drive the adhocratic change within the organization, where they will be very much distributed across the organization to help other teams drive change. And then the more junior people in the department will continue to process finance as finance sake. And what I'm thinking would be a really interesting kind of piece to write is about how I developed these. So how I took the competing values framework, how I want to look at finance, and then how I have developed everything from finance, from first principles in competing values frameworks, all the way through to a financial vignette of a finance team that says, and here's how I've tried to develop that out. And I will use my references, I will use kind of scientific descriptions, but I think it would be really interesting for a lot of people to see just how this process has been undertaken. I have had people kind of review them. I've had people look at them, put feedback in and say, this is what I think you're doing. A lot of people tried to take guesses as to how I was creating these vignettes, what I was separating them by. And I think just having it written down would be, one, incredibly important for the PhD in general, because I'm going to have to write it for the PhD in general anyway. But two, I would actually get it would actually get traction as to, look, there are very many different ways of running finance. Because when people think of a finance team within an organization, they typically think of the semi-introverted, process-driven, running the monthly accounts, budgeting, etc., etc. Whereas actually there's so much more to finance than just that side. And I think it'd be very interesting for financiers to see, well, actually, you could do things differently. You want to create a different culture within your organization or within your finance team, then emphasize different parts of it, put time into the different areas of finance and so on. And I think that would be it would be a very interesting piece to read. And therefore I am going to write it. So that's kind of in the back of my mind, right? How am I going to do this? And I think I'm just going to start writing later today or next week, and just kind of do that whilst kind of the ethics are out of my hands. Because whilst I can't do anything on the ethics, I want to be doing something that progresses my kind of the theoretical side of my work forward. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with all this, which I'm really happy with that. I also want to write a kind of more... this is to do with hobbies, and this is to do with kind of the state of the game in Warhammer 40,000. And long story short, everything in Warhammer is typically determined by a roll of a dice, which is a d6. So 6-sided dice, what you would use in most board games. And one of the issues they have is there are 6 sides of a dice, okay? Which means there are 6 possibilities. Now, 1 is always a failure, and a 6 is always a success in most instances. There are some where it isn't. But let's assume a 1 is a failure and 6 is a success. That means you can only have 4 grades of things in between them. So a kind of... you have failure, partial failure, minimum success, partial success, success. Something like that. You name them as you would in, say, a Likert scale. But what that means, when you only have 4 options, that means there's not a lot of variability. It's either a 2, 3, 4, or 5. Okay? And what that means is every single stat is squished into this thing, and it's how those numbers correspond, and so on. And they introduced a rule called Armour of Contempt that essentially reduces all modifiers to one dice roll by -1. And what that means is the interaction between 2, 3, 4, 5 is even closer than it was before. So, where say you had to roll a 2 and there was a -2 applied, that would become -2, a 2, a 3, a 4. Whereas now, because you reduce the -2 to a -1, it becomes a 2 or 3. And introducing these game-wide rules that do things like this reduces variability. Now, there is fundamental problems at stake anyway, but what I want to do is kind of go over the implications of having such game-wide rules that can have impacts like this, because they can have very serious impacts. Because what happens is stats squish down and they become worth less. Not worthless, but worth less in general. And so what happens is this almost arms race in stats that can work in these situations that don't get squished as much. So I obviously like this from the mathematical side of things, but it's another part of writing that I like kind of exploring game theory in this regards. So that's something I'm going to work on in my kind of spare time. But for now, yeah, I'm very interested in just putting pen to paper about writing up competing values finance. Because I think it's a very interesting starting point, and it doesn't need an experiment attached to it. Most academic publications require an experiment or something like that, whereas this is a purely theoretical concept where I'm saying I am taking what I know about the competing values framework, and I am applying it to a concept that it hasn't been applied to before, finance, and developing it from there. So that is what I think I'm going to start writing, which will be great. I'm looking forward to that. And that's probably what I'll start working on over the next month or so, whilst I am slowly but surely building up my ethics and getting that submitted. That will be the priority, but I want something to be working on in the background. And that's where I am with everything. With regards to the rest of my life, my raiding guild in World of Warcraft stopped raiding, so I have stopped playing, which is good. Like, it doesn't really affect me. I wasn't really enjoying it, but it kind of gives me 2 free evenings again, which is nice. I am back playing Warhammer a bit more casually. Got a couple of events coming up, which is fun. Been playing a lot of board games. That's really nice. I played Ark Nova last Friday, first time. Didn't do very well, but I never expect to do on the first time. And it was a really interesting game with lots of nuance, but also lots of it was incredibly hard to explain, but once you got into it, it was incredibly quick to perform. But it is a long game. I will say that. It's a very long game, but it is very fun and enjoyable game. But you have to kind of appreciate the time you spend on it and so on. So, very happy with that. This weekend, I am hopefully seeing my best friend Toby, and we'll be starting on the second half of Pandemic Legacy Season 0, which will be great. I am very excited for that. And yeah, it's mostly quiet. I think a lot of it will be avoiding the heat. I have a lot of painting that I need to do and a lot of building otherwise. So I'm just going to be busy kind of getting that done in the background. But yeah, just kind of cracking on with everything. I finally 100%ed Elden Ring, which I was very pleased with. It was a very good game. I preferred it on the second run through because I was slightly stronger overall, and therefore it was more kind of forgiving, shall we say. On your first playthrough, where you don't really know everything that's happening, it can be very unforgiving, and I also imagine it's incredibly easy to miss so much of that game. You could completely miss entire storylines and entire subplots if you just followed the kind of main quest through, which would just be like my lasting impression is that all that game needed was kind of a story journal that just said what your last interaction was and highlighted where the person was going or where you might meet them next, because you had to memorize it. And what that means is if you don't have a wiki open or a walkthrough open, you're stuck, really. And I think that I felt was that was the one bit I didn't like about it, where I was like, I constantly had to play with a guide open on a different screen to be able to look at it. And that is the one thing I would say to improve for the second round of it, whenever that comes. I'm going to see Thor Love and Thunder tonight, which I'm excited about. And yeah, Stranger Things ending was excellent. Very, very good. Highly recommend season 4. Probably better than season 3. And I preferred it to season 1 and 2. But whether they are better or not, I will leave, as it's a subjective part. So yeah, that's where everything is at present. Everything's slowly moving forwards. And I'm just going to try and not melt in the sun. So have a good week, everyone. And I look forward to speaking to you next week. So take care and goodbye.